Something changes the instant consciousness begins to listen to itself. The apparent order of the world falters, and a more intelligent kind of silence settles between the lines of everyday life. Certainties become fragile, as if the familiar ground no longer supported the same weight. What once seemed like chance reveals a hidden pattern, and every gesture, every encounter, begins to carry an unsettling precision. It is not about a written destiny, but about a subtle reprogramming operating through the gaze that observes. Quantum consciousness does not invade. It realigns. It corrects old frequencies, dissolves what no longer resonates, and invites the being to cross the discomfort of realizing that the universe has always been responding, just in another language. The first sensation is that of an imperceptible misalignment. Something inside begins to vibrate at another frequency, and what once seemed stable starts to creak from within. Carefully built plans, bonds forged with effort, habits that shaped identity, all begin to lose coherence with a disconcerting softness. It is not the world that collapses, it is perception that changes. And when perception changes, the symbolic foundation of all reality shifts with it. At first, the natural impulse is to resist. There is a part of the mind that insists on restoring the old order, believing that discomfort is a sign of error. However, the pain does not come from a failure, but from the friction between two states of consciousness, the one that is saying goodbye and the one that is still being born. The old self, accustomed to controlling outcomes, tries to understand what is happening, but there is not enough logic to explain the invisible. Quantum consciousness does not impose itself as an external force. It manifests as an inner intelligence that reorganizes what no longer corresponds to the current vibrational field. It is at this point that insecurity reveals itself clearly. What was once synonymous with stability, a career, a relationship, a routine, begins to feel out of place. The body reacts, sleep changes, appetite shifts, and a nameless sense of loss sets in. There is no identifiable culprit, because the movement comes from within. It is as if life has become a more honest mirror, incapable of sustaining any version that is not aligned with the new vibration. This perception is profoundly painful because it destroys the comfort of predictability. For years we have been trained to believe that security is synonymous with permanence. Quantum consciousness, however, teaches the opposite. Security is coherence. What remains only out of habit begins to generate energetic noise, and the universe, in its self-organizing nature, removes these dissonances. The removal may seem like loss, but it is purification. The mind, accustomed to measuring value by continuity, interprets the movement as a threat, while the quantum field merely updates the information to keep the system intact. The discomfort increases when we realize there is no going back. Attempts to revive what has already served its purpose sound artificial, and the heart, even if divided, knows that insisting would be to betray its own evolution. Consciousness begins to reveal a paradox. What once brought safety now imprisons, and what frees causes fear. It is a kind of symbolic death, silent and inevitable. No technique, mantra, or reasoning can stop the process, because it does not depend on will, it depends on resonance. Amid this silent chaos, a new kind of intelligence manifests, the intelligence of collapse. It does not destroy out of cruelty, but out of precision. When the vibrational field changes, everything that does not vibrate at the same frequency dissolves, like particles losing cohesion. Friendships drift apart naturally, projects lose meaning, old desires lose their flavor. At first, it feels like punishment. Later, it becomes clear that it is a delicate realignment, a way for life to say that something more authentic is trying to emerge. Pain then begins to be seen from another angle. It ceases to be an enemy and becomes a messenger. It is the signal that the internal system is being recalibrated. This perception does not eliminate suffering, but it gives it meaning. Knowing that there is a purpose in the dismantling eases the feeling of emptiness. The problem is that purpose rarely reveals itself immediately. It requires trust in the invisible, and trust at this stage is an advanced form of experimental faith, a faith verified not by doctrine, but by direct observation of the micro-effects in daily life. Often the mind tries to negotiate with the process, asking for gradual changes, but consciousness does not negotiate. It responds to the present vibration. If the vibration changes suddenly, the rearrangement will also be sudden. The universe does not punish, it only mirrors. This realization provokes humility. For the first time, control reveals itself as an illusion, and what remains is only the choice to go with the flow or resist until exhaustion. It is at this point that something silent begins to reveal itself. Quantum consciousness does not seek comfort, it seeks integrity. It is never in a hurry, but it is precise. Every undone situation, every plan that does not unfold, every unexpected loss functions like a line of code being rewritten in real time. The personality panics, the ego grieves, but the field reorganizes with impersonal wisdom. And when the emotional dust begins to settle, one perceives that life in its deepest form was never out of control. It was simply operating at a level we did not yet know how to read. This is the pain of realizing that quantum consciousness is changing everything that once seemed safe. It is not the destruction of destiny, but the realignment with your truth. Discomfort is the price of coherence, and at the exact point where the old structure gives way, the new destiny begins to write itself, not as a promise but as a natural consequence of vibration becoming aware of itself. There comes a moment when the structure of life begins to feel misaligned with its own inner rhythm. The work that once brought meaning begins to feel heavy, conversations sound artificial, commitments repeat an old choreography that no longer fits. Nothing has visibly changed, but something within has changed so much that the outer world no longer knows how to respond. It is the natural disorganization that occurs when the vibrational field expands, but the old forms still try to contain it. The body feels it before the mind understands. Breathing changes, time seems to flow at another pace, and what was stable becomes unstable without logical explanation. This disorder is neither punishment nor bad luck. It is a physical consequence of frequency change. When consciousness alters its vibration, the structures created in another energetic band lose support. The old destiny, that fabric of choices, beliefs, and repetitions, begins to unravel because it no longer resonates with the new information being emitted. It is like trying to tune an old radio station with a modern device. The sound comes out distorted, voices overlap, and the silence between the noises feels truer than any audible message. At first, the mind calls it chaos, but chaos, seen closely, is merely the not yet understood geometry of a new pattern. Life falls apart not to destroy, but to reorganize itself around a higher coherence. People who seemed essential may drift away without drama, opportunities disappear to open gaps that only later will make sense, and time folds in unexpected ways, blending urgency and suspension. It is as if the universe needed to mess up the scenery to reveal the real stage where the next act will unfold. The feeling is disconcerting because the ego feeds on predictability. It defines itself through control of variables, plans, and outcomes. When everything escapes the plan, it feels as if the ground is disappearing. But quantum consciousness does not destroy the ground. It expands it. What once seemed like the limit of existence reveals itself as just one coordinate among many. Disorganization arises when the new vibration begins to attract circumstances compatible with it, and these circumstances naturally conflict with what was built under the old frequency. The result is a transition period that seems like disorder, but is reprogramming in progress. At this stage, time behaves strangely. Some days drag endlessly, while others pass in a breath. Meaningful encounters seem orchestrated by a greater intelligence, and coincidences take on the force of signals. The universe begins to communicate in symbolic ways, and every event, however small, becomes the bearer of a coded message. The rational mind tries to interpret everything, but the quantum field operates in the language of resonance, not logic. What matters is not understanding the symbol, but feeling what it awakens. It is at this point that transformation ceases to be a concept and becomes direct experience. Disorganization is also a test of trust. When the old destiny begins to crumble, there are no guarantees that the new one is ready. It is an intermediate space, a kind of vibrational void, where old coordinates no longer work, but the new ones have not yet stabilized. This void is uncomfortable because it offers no external reference. The only possible compass becomes inner sensitivity, a listening deeper than reason. The body becomes an antenna, and feeling gains authority over thinking. It is in this state of surrender that consciousness begins to act more directly, guiding seemingly irrational decisions that later prove to be precise. Many try to force the chaos back into order, quickly rebuilding what has collapsed, seeking to restore the old normality. But the old normal is an expired code. When vibration rises, the field seeks new arrangements. Forcing a return to the old pattern is trying to shrink the soul to fit into an outdated structure. The discomfort grows because the new energy needs to flow, and every attempt at repression creates internal friction, anxiety, exhaustion, a feeling of being out of oneself. In a way, that is true. You are outside your old version, in transit toward a version more coherent with the flow of consciousness. Over time, this disorganization begins to reveal its hidden precision. What seemed random proves surgical. People who drifted away made space for more aligned connections. Material losses turned into energetic freedom. Situations that once provoked fear reveal themselves as opportunities for integration. Gradually, chaos bends to a new order, not one imposed, but one that naturally emerges from the renewed vibration. Life, which seemed fragmented, rediscovers a silent axis. Not the axis of control, but of presence. Then it becomes clear that the old destiny has not disappeared. It has merely dissolved into what it needed to learn. What remains is not emptiness, but an open matrix ready to be coded by new consciousness. The disorganization was the process of cleansing the residues of the old script. And when the new begins to take shape, there is no longer fear of losing control, because control is no longer the center. Coherence is. Vibration has become the new map, and everything in tune with it begins to manifest naturally. The apparent collapse of the old life is, in truth, the birth of a frequency that no longer fits within the old structures. And in that birth, disorder is merely the sound of the universe reconfiguring itself to follow the new pulse of consciousness. Chaos is not the end. It is the interval between two states of harmony. It is the echo of a destiny rewriting itself from within, obeying an intelligence that has always been there, waiting for the moment when the being would become capable of hearing it. The first shock does not come from the world, but from within. Something inside begins to refuse the old impulse to hold everything with your hands. The mind tries to keep the rhythm that has always worked, but the body exposes the effort. The chest tightens, thought repeats arguments that no longer convince, and a silent tension grows between the impulse to command and the desire to simply let things happen. At this point, consciousness finds itself divided between two forces that do not cancel each other out. One cries out for direction, the other asks for surrender. Neither of them is wrong. They simply represent different phases of the same movement of expansion. The fear of losing control has deep roots. It was born in a time when controlling meant surviving. For years, the being believed that only the rational mind could protect it from chaos. To predict, calculate, anticipate, all of this created a sense of mastery over uncertainty. But quantum consciousness begins to corrode this foundation, not out of cruelty, but out of precision. It shows that control does not prevent the unforeseen. It only postpones the encounter with the truth. And the truth is that life has always moved through an invisible flow, an intelligence that acts even when the ego believes it is deciding. When this understanding begins to mature, vertigo arises. The being realizes that it was never truly in command, and even so everything somehow worked. This realization is liberating and frightening at the same time. Part of oneself wants to celebrate the lightness of letting go, but another part fears disappearing if it is not the one leading. It is at this point that the conflict becomes unbearable. The soul asks for trust, and the ego demands guarantees. The result is a state of inner tension that seems to have no way out. Fear insists on saying that trusting is dangerous, that the flow can fail, that without vigilance destiny disintegrates. And the mind, an expert at creating defensive narratives, reinforces the discourse. It makes plans, organizes lists, builds justifications to remain in the known. But the body feels the exhaustion of this game. Emotions become dense, time loses fluidity, and everyday life starts to revolve around a constant need to confirm that everything is still under control. This confirmation never comes because the flow does not allow itself to be measured by human metrics. It manifests in synchronicities, intuitions, subtle shifts, signs that require another kind of attention, more sensory than rational. Trusting the flow is not becoming passive. It is acting in tune with the intelligence that reveals itself in the moment, without the arrogance of wanting to predict the outcome. It is responding to the present with presence. This attitude is not taught by theory. It is a training of listening. The being needs to relearn to feel before deciding. When the mind tries to solve everything through logic, it creates distance between what one feels and what one does. When one allows oneself to feel, the body aligns with the quantum field and action arises spontaneously as a natural extension of the vibration. In this state, the result matters less than the coherence of the choice. Little by little, fear begins to show itself in a different light. It ceases to be an enemy and becomes a signaler. It indicates the exact point at which consciousness still resists expansion. When the being observes it without running away, it realizes that fear has always been just a request for safety. And safety is not found in control, but in inner coherence. The flow, contrary to what the ego believes, is not disorder. It is an organization at a higher level, where each event fulfills an adjustment function. Trust arises when the gaze learns to recognize this hidden pattern behind apparent chance. Transformation becomes evident when the being begins to act from this state. Decisions stop being born of anxiety and begin to spring from a lucid silence. Situations resolve with less effort, relationships become more authentic, and time, once fragmented, gains a broader texture. Control, which once seemed synonymous with power, reveals itself as a defense mechanism. Trust, on the other hand, proves to be true creative force. The universe responds not to the attempt to dominate, but to the vibration of one who is in harmony with one's own flow. Even so, surrender does not happen all at once. The impulse to control returns in waves, especially when the unknown approaches. The difference is that now the being recognizes the movement and does not identify with it as much. It observes fear, thanks it for its presence, but chooses to act from trust. Each time this happens, the old structure loses power, the flow becomes clearer, and life comes to be guided by an intelligence that does not need explanations. In the end, control is not destroyed, it is merely repositioned. It ceases to be a tyrant and becomes a tool. It serves to organize what is essential, not to imprison the unexpected. Consciousness finds a new balance. The ego executes, the soul guides. Fear loses its command function and becomes sensitivity. The being understands at last that trusting is not giving up. It is cooperating with the invisible order that has always sustained movement. When this perception stabilizes, the inner conflict dissolves. Fear and trust cease to alternate and begin to dance to the same beat. And in that beat, the flow of consciousness becomes the true center of life. The most painful part of awakening is not the unknown, but the moment when the known begins to come undone. What once sustained meaning begins to peel away from the soul, like old paint from a wall that needs renovation. Carefully constructed plans lose their luster. People who seemed permanent follow other paths, and life fragments into small goodbyes that do not ask permission. All of this happens with a strange precision, as if an invisible force were editing the script from within, removing what no longer fits in the new vibrational field that is beginning to form. At first, the mind tries to resist. It seeks explanations, creates narratives, blames destiny, questions spirituality. Why is this happening now, it insists, as if there were an error underway. But quantum consciousness does not err. It only reorganizes. When the inner vibration rises, everything that is not in coherence with it loses support. Structures that do not resonate begin to dissolve naturally, and what the ego calls loss is, in fact, a realignment. Suffering arises because the mind still tries to preserve the old format of reality, while the field is already operating at another frequency. The collapse of plans is the first sign that purpose is calling. Life, which seemed to follow a predictable line, begins to show unexpected curves. What was considered failure begins to reveal a precision that is understood only with time. The job that ends, the project that does not materialize, the relationship that breaks. Everything seems unfair at first glance, but silently, each rupture serves to free energy trapped in contexts that no longer favor growth. The pain is inevitable because attachment does not disappear immediately. The human heart needs time to understand the meaning of change. In relationships, this process becomes even more visible. Connections formed under an old vibration do not endure when the consciousness of one side begins to expand. Conversations lose depth, encounters become tiring, and a kind of energetic distance sets in, even if people are still physically close. In some cases, the distancing happens abruptly, almost without explanation. In others, it dissolves gradually, like a receding tide. In any case, the movement is the same. The universe removes what prevents the flow from remaining coherent. This letting go is not punishment, it is purification. Quantum consciousness does not subtract by chance, it only relocates. When a relationship ends, the space that opens is not emptiness, it is fertile ground for the next configuration of life. But the being, accustomed to associating love with permanence, suffers when bonds transform. Suffering, however, is also the field where new understanding germinates. It reveals the depth of identifications and teaches detachment not as a concept, but as living practice. Trusting this process is allowing love to expand beyond form. The same happens with plans. Many of them were created by older versions of oneself, based on fears and desires that no longer vibrate at the new frequency. When consciousness changes, purpose also changes. What seemed like an objective becomes a limitation. Even so, the ego tries to revive the old script because the absence of a plan feels like a threat. Only after exhausting every attempt to rebuild the past does the being finally understand. Destiny does not unravel, it updates. Purpose is not a goal to be reached, but a tuning to be discovered. And this tuning only reveals itself when the space is cleared of intentions that have already fulfilled their function. During this transition, suffering is the fire that purifies. It burns layers of resistance, transforms loss into understanding, and solitude into listening. What seemed like destruction proves to be a process of vibrational refinement. Each loss removes a noise from the field. Each farewell returns energy to the flow. Little by little, pain begins to carry an implicit wisdom. Everything that leaves is fulfilling the role of making room for what truly corresponds to the new vibration. This perception does not erase mourning, but it gives meaning to the emptiness. At some point, consciousness realizes that purpose is not something found outside, but something that reveals itself when interferences cease. It was always there, silent, waiting for distractions to dissolve. What seemed like loss reveals itself as decompression, a relief disguised as sadness. Life, by removing what does not resonate, returns the being to its essence, and what was once a search becomes presence. The true purpose does not need to be discovered, only remembered. And this remembering happens only when the inner space is clean enough for the voice of the soul to be heard. The suffering of watching plans and relationships come undone is, at its core, the rite of passage between control and coherence. Each bond that breaks, each dream that dissolves, is a line of the old destiny being erased so that the new can be written without distortion. Quantum consciousness does not destroy what has been lived. It gathers the information and transforms it into wisdom. What remains after the dismantling is simpler, lighter, truer. And when one finally accepts that nothing essential is lost, suffering turns into gratitude. From there, the being begins to recognize that the losses were merely the way the universe cleared the path for the real purpose to bloom. What seemed like an end was a beginning. What seemed like absence was expansion. And the pain, which before seemed like punishment, reveals itself as the precise touch of consciousness shaping destiny in its purest form, one that no longer depends on control, only on presence. When the universe starts moving the pieces of your life without consulting your plans, the mind reacts like someone waking up in unfamiliar territory. Nothing seems to be in the right place. References lose sharpness, certainties slip through your fingers, and a sense arises that something greater has taken control of the narrative. The being, accustomed to deciding, now feels led. This reversal of direction provokes a deep emotional confusion because it dismantles the myth of total autonomy. It is as if a silent, patient, invisible intelligence began to redraw the path. And all you can do is watch, resisting and accepting at the same time. The first reaction is always astonishment. The mind tries to understand the logic behind sudden changes, the unexpected loss, the opportunity that falls through, the unlikely meeting that changes the course of everything. But quantum consciousness does not follow the linear logic of human reasoning. It operates through vibrational coherence, not personal convenience. When the internal frequency changes, the surrounding field needs to reconfigure, even if the conscious self has not yet asked for it. This reconfiguration may look like chaos, but it is merely a precise realignment, the universe adjusting the stage so that the new version of you can find space to exist. Confusion is born in the gap between what is being felt and what has not yet been understood. The heart intuits that there is a hidden meaning, but the mind, fearing the void, tries to translate everything into causes and effects. The problem is that the new field of consciousness does not explain itself in the language of cause, only of correspondence. What arrives does not come to punish or reward, but to balance. This neutrality of life may seem cold, but it is precisely there that the wisdom of the flow resides. Pain and joy cease to be opposites and become merely different expressions of the same energetic reorganization. It is natural to feel anger, frustration, or abandonment when destiny shifts without warning. The human being has been conditioned to measure safety by control and value by outcome. When the universe changes course without permission, it feels like betrayal. But what is really being hurt is not the heart. It is the ego, which believed it had the map. The heart, if listened to calmly, recognizes the movement. It knows that life does not steal, it only trades. What leaves was ready to go, and what arrives brings the next learning. The problem is that the time between one thing and another is an emotional desert, a space in which nothing seems to make sense. In this desert, solitude becomes a teacher. It is there that the being discovers that control was never safety, only distraction. Emotions oscillate like the tide, now revolt, now surrender, now apathy. The confusion comes from the fact that the internal system is learning a new language. Before, it reacted. Now, it needs to respond. Before, it demanded guarantees. Now, it is invited to trust without seeing. Quantum consciousness does not promise comfort. It promises coherence. And coherence often requires the dismantling of everything that was built outside the truth. Over time, this confusion begins to reveal layers of wisdom. The being realizes that the universe is not against it. It is in favor of its expansion. Changes that seemed unwanted prove to be surgical. The relationship that ended makes room for a more authentic way of loving. The job that ended gives back time to create. Financial loss teaches detachment and reorganizes priorities. It is as if life were using circumstances to calibrate the field of vibration and return the individual to the path of purpose. Emotional confusion is, then, the symptom of a recalibration in progress. The mind wants answers, but the heart begins to ask for silence, and in that silence something begins to align. Little by little, the need to understand gives way to a serene curiosity. What is this trying to teach me? This simple question shifts the axis of the experience. Suffering loses the force of victimhood and becomes observation. The pain remains, but now it has direction. The chaos continues, but it begins to show rhythm. And the being realizes that the universe does not lead without purpose. It only acts before the mind understands. When this perception matures, emotional confusion does not disappear, but it transforms into reverence. A deep respect for the mystery arises. The being no longer needs to understand everything. It is enough to be present. Control dissolves into trust, and with it, the burden of carrying the world on one's own shoulders. The universe has always led. The difference is that now the being becomes aware of it. And in this recognition, a new form of peace is born. Not the peace of what is static, but the peace of what moves in tune with something greater. The universe's call never comes to destroy, but to align. Even when it seems unjust, it is working in favor of the soul's coherence. Emotional confusion is the echo of this reorganization. And when the being finally accepts that it is not a victim of the flow, but part of it, what was once fear becomes gratitude. Life begins to pulse again with a lightness that does not come from the absence of pain, but from the presence of meaning. If these words touch something inside you, if you also feel that the universe is moving the pieces in a way your mind does not yet understand, take a deep breath, accept what is forming, and share this vibration. Like this content and write in the comments, "I trust the flow even when I don't understand the path." May this gesture be the first step of your conscious surrender. The most critical point of the journey happens when everything seems to turn against you. Things stop fitting together, projects stall, people drift away, and the future, once clear, turns into a thick fog. The mind tries to keep its composure, but inside a sense of disorder arises that borders on collapse. It is as if the universe had suddenly forgotten you. Every effort seems to generate the opposite effect, and the natural impulse is to think that something is going terribly wrong. However, it is precisely in this apparent chaos that quantum consciousness performs its most precise work. Collapse is not a punishment, it is a recalibration. Reality begins to reorganize according to the new vibration that the being has begun to emit. What was compatible with the old frequency no longer responds, and what is new has not yet materialized. This interval is the quantum limbo of transformation, the point at which the wave has not yet collapsed into form, and everything seems suspended between what was and what will be. The mind interprets this as failure because it measures life by visible results. But the quantum field measures by coherence, and coherence often requires dismantling before rebuilding. During this phase, it is common to feel purposeless. Enthusiasm disappears, routines lose meaning, and a kind of silent exhaustion sets in. Attempts to solve the chaos with mental effort only intensify the sense of loss. This happens because the energetic field has already changed, but behavior still tries to operate by the old rules. It is like trying to tune into a new station while keeping the radio on the previous frequency. The sound comes out distorted, noise dominates, and the silence between the static seems like the only true thing. That silence is the point of realignment. It is there in the void that the path begins to reposition itself. Quantum consciousness acts in a way that is rarely perceived in real time. It does not offer explanations, only movements, and these movements, seen up close, look like contradictions. What once flowed now jams, what seemed stable collapses. But if the gaze widens, one begins to perceive a hidden intelligence operating behind the losses. Every obstacle is a disguised reorientation. Delay is protection, error is correction, and apparent failure is a necessary pruning so that something more authentic can bloom. Difficulty is not the end of the path. It is the exact detour to take you to a territory that reason would never dare to choose. The greatest suffering comes from trying to speed up the process. The impatient mind wants immediate answers. It looks for culprits, solutions, shortcuts. However, the field does not move out of haste, but out of precision. It waits for the inner vibration to be sufficiently stable to sustain the new alignment. Until that happens, the universe seems to push the being inward so that it reconnects with the original frequency of its consciousness. It is in this turning inward that life begins to rebuild itself from the essential. The path repositions itself not from the outside in, but from the inside out. The phase in which everything seems to go wrong is, in fact, the revelation of noises that were previously covered. Incoherences come to the surface to be seen, masks break, hidden intentions show themselves, and misaligned relationships reveal themselves through friction. What causes pain is not the end, but the clash between emerging lucidity and the structures that resist it. The being, previously identified with the character it was playing, begins to realize that it is being invited to live as consciousness, not as a role. and this requires the courage to let die what no longer sustains the truth. Over time, chaos becomes pedagogical. It teaches that visible order is not always a sign of harmony, and that apparent loss of control may be the sign of a deeper realignment. Life begins to reorganize itself in subtle ways. A casual conversation reveals a new direction. An old idea resurfaces with another meaning. A sudden silence returns clarity. Nothing happens by chance. Each movement is part of a precise engineering that ordinary sight cannot yet decipher. Quantum consciousness is only recalibrating the field so that destiny becomes coherent with the new vibration. It is important to understand that this phase is not a test, but an adjustment. There is no invisible judge assessing performance. There is an energy field seeking congruence between what is felt, what is thought, and what is done. The greater the gap between these levels, the stronger the discomfort. Repositioning, therefore, is an invitation to authenticity. It asks that every gesture, every word, and every intention pass through the filter of inner truth. Everything that does not resonate with that truth dissolves, not out of punishment, but due to vibrational incompatibility. The apparent going wrong is the universe removing what prevents the flow from aligning. When the being accepts this, the pain begins to lose strength. Chaos becomes a process, not a sentence. And perception changes. What once seemed like loss reveals itself as purification. What seemed like delay shows itself as synchronicity, and what seemed like emptiness turns into creative space. Quantum consciousness does not destroy paths. It redraws them according to the soul's current vibration. With this understanding, the collapse phase becomes a turning point. The being stops fighting the movement and begins to cooperate with it. And at that very moment, the universe responds. Doors that were closed begin to move. Coincidences multiply and meaning returns. What seemed like disorder reveals its invisible geometry, and life finally flows again, not because the circumstances changed, but because consciousness learned to see. There comes a point in the crossing when something silent is revealed. Nothing was lost, only translated into another language. What once seemed like destruction begins to show itself as transcription. The fragments of plans, the relationships cut short, the paths that collapsed. Everything suddenly fits into a new invisible order. The mind, which for so long believed that destiny had been erased, begins to understand that it is only being rewritten by a broader intelligence that works with data that linear consciousness is not capable of accessing. The impact of this perception is profound, almost physical. It is as if the whole body breathed a sigh of relief, recognizing that the chaos was not the end, but the interval between two levels of coherence. The first consequence of this understanding is an inner silence. The noise of doubt begins to cease, not because all the answers have been found, but because the need for answers loses its urgency. The being understands that destiny is not a straight line drawn in time, but a field of possibilities that updates as the vibration changes. Nothing was being destroyed, only relocated to a more coherent version of one's own consciousness. This perception generates a kind of mature humility, recognizing that life is infinitely wiser than any personal planning. In this new state, past events begin to take on a different meaning. Losses stop seeming like injustices and come to be seen as adjustments. Farewells reveal their liberating function, and even the most intense pains turn into turning points that led to the current clarity. The gaze changes. What used to be, "Why did this happen to me?" becomes, "For what did this happen in me?" This shift in question changes the entire field of perception. The being stops feeling like a victim of the flow and begins to recognize itself as a co-author of a quantum process in constant updating. Recognizing that destiny is being rewritten is realizing that life never missed the mark. Even routes that seemed like detours were indispensable parts of the learning that prepared consciousness to sustain the new level of vibration. Pain, failure, and loss were not interruptions, but exercises in expansion. Each one tuned the inner instrument, calibrating the frequency that now begins to emit a new reality. This realization does not erase the scars, but it illuminates them. Suffering gains context, and the past, instead of a prison, becomes a library. The impact of this shift is not only mental, it is vibrational. Something changes in the structure of presence. Breathing deepens, gestures become slower, and the perception of time expands. What once was urgency becomes rhythm. The being begins to walk with a quiet confidence, not because it knows what will come, but because it feels that the path responds to its inner state. Quantum consciousness begins to operate more directly, and the universe seems to synchronize with the small movements of the soul. Destiny ceases to be a linear narrative and becomes a living conversation between vibration and form. This rewriting also redefines the notion of purpose. Before, purpose was seen as an external objective, something to be achieved. Now it reveals itself as a natural consequence of inner alignment. The being realizes that it does not need to chase meaning, it only needs to be in coherence with what it is. When this coherence stabilizes, circumstances reorganize themselves. The right work, the right people, the right opportunities begin to emerge with a precision that cannot be explained, only observed. It is life responding to the vibrational clarity of the new level of consciousness. However, recognizing this new order also brings a deep emotional impact. Upon realizing that nothing was truly lost, a mixture of relief and melancholy arises. Relief, because the pain finally finds purpose. Melancholy, because it is impossible not to miss the older version of oneself that believed it needed to control everything. It is a serene, almost sacred morning, the morning of the character who fulfilled its role. The old self dissolves, and in its place an open, available space appears where the future can project itself without rigidity. It is in this space that the rewritten destiny begins to take shape. The mind, out of habit, tries to compare the new with the old. It wants to measure how much has changed. It wants to predict what will come. But the new destiny does not fit into comparisons. It is not a repetition on a larger scale. It is a change of dimension. It is like trying to translate music into numbers. The sound exists, but calculation never fully captures it. Quantum consciousness writes in waves, and each wave contains multiple possible futures. The question is not which of them will happen, but which of them the being is ready to sustain. This readiness is determined by vibration, and vibration is shaped by the degree of presence. The final impact of this understanding is the release from fear. When the being realizes that nothing is truly lost, only transformed, attachment begins to dissolve. Time ceases to be an enemy, error loses the power to condemn, and destiny ceases to be a sentence to become a creative field. Living becomes an act of co-authorship with the universe, a dance between intention and surrender. Quantum consciousness does not erase the previous script, it only writes over it at a higher frequency, preserving the essence and eliminating the distortions. At the moment, this perception stabilizes. The being understands that chaos was never random, and destiny was never linear. Everything that seemed to be crumbling was only being redesigned on another level, a level where control gives way to clarity and fear turns into reverence. The impact of recognizing this is so intense that the very concept of error ceases to make sense. The universe never gets lost. It only repositions itself until it finds the right note in the melody of consciousness. And when that happens, the being finally understands. Destiny was not destroyed, only tuned to play in resonance with what, from the beginning, it has always been. There comes a moment when pain begins to make sense. The pieces that once seemed scattered start to fit together silently, and what once seemed like mere suffering reveals itself as part of a broader design. No loss was random, no absence was punishment. Everything fulfilled the role of preparing the inner ground so that the new could establish itself without the distortions of the old. This understanding does not arise from reasoning. It matures like a memory that has always been there, but only now finds language to express itself. It is a slow, delicate, almost imperceptible awakening, yet one that completely changes the relationship with one's own story. The being begins to perceive that losses were instruments of refinement. Each one removed something that prevented coherence from manifesting, a bond, a belief, an identity, an expectation. And although each removal hurt, The space left by it allowed a clearer frequency to enter. Quantum consciousness does not take away what has value. It only removes what blocks the flow of what is truly essential. The problem is that the ego, attached to form, cannot recognize the value of loss while going through the process. It only sees emptiness, without realizing that this emptiness is the womb where the new is being gestated. The awakening of understanding does not occur in a single moment of enlightenment, but in small epiphanies that arise in daily life. A scent, a conversation, a random memory can trigger the realization that everything made sense. The suffering, once fragmented, aligns into a coherent narrative. The person who left taught detachment. Failure revealed the limits of control. Silence showed the importance of listening. Every event that seemed disconnected becomes a fragment of the same learning. Consciousness was preparing the being to sustain a new vibration, and the price of that preparation was the deconstruction of everything that could not accompany it. Over time, the view of the past changes. The mind stops narrating the story in terms of losses and begins to describe it as a process of distillation. Experiences cease to be classified as good or bad and start to be seen as necessary. This change in perspective dissolves guilt and resentment, two weights that had kept the flow stagnant. The heart, freed from them, begins to beat to another rhythm. A new lightness arises, a serenity that depends not on circumstances, but on understanding. The being perceives that even in the darkest periods there was an intelligence at work, an invisible geometry, guiding it back to the center of itself. This perception also changes the relationship with time. The future ceases to be a place of expectation, and the past ceases to be a depository of regrets. Everything condenses into the now, not as a spiritual concept, but as a concrete experience. The present becomes the point where all lines of destiny converge, and it is there that the new alignment manifests. When the being is in coherence, time is no longer an obstacle, it becomes an ally. What needs to arrive, arrives. What needs to leave, leaves. Life moves with the same precision that governs the movement of the stars, and consciousness, by recognizing it, aligns itself with the same cosmic rhythm. This awakening also brings an unexpected tenderness for everything that has been. The old versions of oneself, once seen with shame or regret, are now welcomed with compassion. They did not err. They simply sustained what was possible at that stage of the journey. Mature consciousness does not judge, it integrates. Each fall was necessary to learn how to rise without haste. Each closure of a cycle was a way for the universe to teach that movement is not linear, but spiral. And in each turn of this spiral, something is purified, something is refined, something becomes truer. Recognizing that each loss was preparation completely changes the way of dealing with present suffering. Pain ceases to be an enemy to be defeated and becomes an ally in the polishing of the soul. The being begins to listen to it instead of fighting it, and by listening it realizes that pain never wanted to punish, only to draw attention to misalignment. Every discomfort, every frustration is a message from the field asking for adjustment. When the being understands this, suffering loses the power to paralyze and turns into direction. What once was resistance turns into learning, and what was loss reveals itself as precision. This understanding does not make life immune to pain, but it changes the quality of pain. It becomes transparent, like a portal that leads deeper into one's own consciousness. Suffering is no longer interpreted as failure, but as passage, and by crossing this passage with presence, the being discovers that alignment is not a state to be achieved, but a continuous movement of adjustment. Quantum consciousness does not deliver a final version of the self. It keeps the process alive, updating vibration with each choice, each thought, each moment of lucidity. When this awakening stabilizes, the being realizes that losses did not take anything away. They gave back. They gave back authenticity, simplicity, presence. Each farewell opened space for a reunion with something essential. Each emptiness became fertile ground for a new expression of the soul. And it is in this silent integration that alignment reveals itself, not as destiny, but as a state of coherence between what is felt, what is thought, and what is. The past, finally, ceases to be shadow and becomes diffuse light, illuminating the path not through nostalgia but through wisdom. The gradual awakening of understanding is the point where suffering transforms into reverence. The being looks back and realizes that everything was part of the same gesture, the gesture of the universe, teaching it to become transparent enough for consciousness to flow without resistance. And in that instant, the heart understands. Nothing was taken away. Everything was returned to the truth. When consciousness awakens to its own power to reorganize reality, destiny ceases to be something that happens and becomes something that responds. Each loss, each silence, and each detour reveal themselves as parts of an invisible precision, guiding the being back to the center. Nothing was in vain. Everything that seemed like collapse was only the universe adjusting the vibration so that the new could bloom. And at this point, fear gives way to trust and life begins to flow in coherence with what is true. If you have felt this transformation within yourself, write in the comments, "I am ready to live in alignment," and subscribe to continue walking through these new dimensions of consciousness.